So now we're going to talk about the Erechtheion. The Erechtheion is about 40 feet across the courtyard from the Parthenon, and it's the last building, I suppose, that you would encounter when you were going on the Panathenaic procession. There's some ideas involved with the Erechtheion. First of all, that it was a place for the legendary king Erechtheus, and that's whenever you see Theon after a name, it literally means the place of. So Erechtheion, Erechtheus was this king who sacrificed his daughters in some sort of mythical era for Athens. It is a porch or a complex that is kind of a weird structure. It really doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of how it looks. What I'm kind of talking about is it's several compartments or containers. It's really almost like 4 or 5 temples that have been put together as a series of porches and areas. And the reason for this is it's probably a temple for several of the gods, including Zeus and Poseidon. And so there's a lot of storytelling that's involved with it. So first of all, the story relates back to Athena and Poseidon competing over who was going to be the sort of mascot or god who is in charge of Athens, or be the patron saint of Athens. Obviously, Athena won. And the story is basically that Poseidon, in order to compete, threw his trident down into the earth, and a bubbling spring sprang up, which, according to some legends, was fresh water. Another legend I heard, or another myth, was that it was salt water. But basically, that was very nice, and they still haven't located the so-called subterranean spring that does that. But then Athena comes along and she makes an olive tree grow. And olive trees are kind of important because they take several generations to grow. They're a symbol of peace throughout all of these different cultures, even in Christian culture, right? And you offer the olive branch. We have that in the Old Testament, where the dove comes back after Noah. And it's because olive trees take several generations to bear fruit and to be a fruitful tree. And from olives you can get oil, and from the wood you can get the tree. So obviously Athena was chosen as the goddess. So there is probably a altar to Erechtheus. There's an altar to Poseidon in there. There's, I think, another king or a god named Kekrops who has a little space in there. And each one of the little structures really doesn't have a cohesion to the other one. There's also even a structure where there's a hole in the roof where Zeus supposedly threw down a thunderbolt or a lightning bolt, and it struck the ground, and so they have an open area for it. The most famous part of the Erechtheion is actually a porch. The porch is called the Porch of the Maidens, and it actually has these figures called the Caryatids. Caryatid is just a derivative of a term that comes from this priestess of the temple of Artemis at Caria. And the Caryatid basically is a draped form that represents a female. And what I always think of when I look at these is sort of those jokes about mothers complaining about, like, I'm just a piece of furniture to you. Oh my God. You know, that kind of thing, where sometimes women are treated as sort of accoutrements or furniture. And in some ways, I think this expresses the attitude of the Athenians towards women in general. And you can look at it in a positive or a negative light, I suppose. You can look at it as a negative statement, or a positive statement based on what your point of view is. So basically the women are the columns that support the surface. They're also, women's bodies are things that they want to be seen. And if you look a little bit closer at how they're standing, it's almost like the Porch of Maidens is a chorus line, because they're all standing in contrapposto, but the leg that's extended is opposite the other leg when you cut the porch in half. In fact, this porch was so influential that Augustus Caesar sent some people to take casts of this porch and had caryatid columns supporting one of his own temples in Rome. So if we look a little bit closer at this Porch of the Maidens and at the figures, the first thing that you'll see is that they're standing in a contrapposto. Their heads are kind of baskets that would be supporting the entablature of the structure. So they are literally holding up the culture, holding up the building, might be the symbolic value of this. There's wet drapery that is very revealing, which, again, remember that there's an edict or a sort of, it's not considered good taste to show a nude female form in Athenian Greece at that point in time. Is until much later, with the late Hellenistic period, or the Hellenistic period with Praxiteles and the Aphrodite of Cnidos that we look at. And the capital that's on top of their head is actually, it looks like a series of darts in between a series of eggs. So it's been called the egg and dart pattern. And I think it looks almost like a basket, the way women would be carrying baskets in some countries to do labor. So we move down the body, we can see that the drapery is wet drapery style that reveals the form, but also keeps her clothed at the same time. So you can basically say, oh, I'm not really showing off anything, but you get to show off the female form. Then the next part is that the way the drapery is carved, besides revealing some segments of the body, it also looks kind of like the fluting on columns. The faces in general are idealized in that 5th century Athenian way, probably have the slightly archaic smile and the way that the eyes are a little overly large that we looked at before. One of the arms probably would have been extended, kind of like the Kore figures that we looked at, that, you know, Athens has a big tradition of this, and there were Kore figures found on the Acropolis, and possibly they would have had one hand extended, almost like those grave figures holding a pomegranate.